and welcome to our first episode of Women in Focus, where we showcase the difference that women have made in a society, in different stratas of government, in politics, and in business, and to also gauge how people view the influence that women have made in our Constitution and also impacting on policy. And it is my privilege to invite our guests today, and joining us, amazing woman indeed, a Deputy President of Black First, the Land First, Zanele Luana, and we have Kim Heller, who is a political analyst and contributor as well to our sister publication, TNA. But before we go there, though, we also had an interview with Mama Paulina Mohale, who joined politics at a very young age. And Mama Mohale was one of the young women who were active in the 1976 uprising that also culminated into the freedom that we enjoy. Let's take a look at this. When you look back, I mean, this is part of your history, the legacy, and a photo album that you keep with you. And this particular picture is of yourself as a young lady, the age of 26, being arrested for standing up for your own human rights and liberation. Talk us through this particular moment.
Yeah, I was arrested at the border gate of Swaziland. I was tortured at Krugersdorp prison. I was not treated like a human being, because at some stage they will kick food for us, and I will kick the food back to the prison warder to say, and they will call the surgeon to say the isolasi velnikos yetni. When they come to my cell, they will beg me to eat. Then I said, no, I'm not her dog. She cannot kick the food for me. And I was taken to Pretoria, to John Foster Square, where I was told I was going to be made to stand on top of the table and fly through the window. A lot of students died that way on the 10th floor. So my mom also was arrested there, and I didn't know what happened thereafter. I was then taken to Pretoria Maximum Prison, where I was given a case by the name of the Pretoria 12, the 11 men and 1 woman, as we can see, as a terrorist. We'll end up being terrorists when we were fighting for justice and also for liberation, for better education and better life for all.
Did you have concerns for your loved ones and your fellow comrades at the time?
Yes, I did have concern on them, but as long as they can be liberated, even if I die, it's okay. We were marching on, following the steps of our legend, Abu Baba Nelson Mandela, in prison, to say they were fighting for this cause, and we are going to achieve it.
That's an interview we had with Mama Mohale, talking about her experience at a very young age being detained and fighting for the liberation of South Africa. We're joined now in studio by Zanele Luana, Deputy President of Black First, the Land First, and Kim Heller, political analyst and commentator as well. Welcome, ladies, and thanks so much for joining us. Do you think that we understand the severity and the gravitas of the terror that women in politics experience prior to our democracy? I'll start with you, Kim.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. And listening to that very heartfelt story, I think today we haven't honored women properly. We haven't reflected their roles historically in the struggle. And if we look at the landscape of politics, we find that women do not take pride of place in the political sphere. They tend to be deputies, they tend to be cast in supporting roles rather than as the lead in the whole political game. And that's very unfortunate, because if we look back at our history and the liberation of this country politically anyway, we see women have been at the forefront, but today they're not reflected. And in most political parties, we see a tendency of men dominating the discourse, and women in society, particularly African women, being the most vulnerable and the most abused. And yet we have a political elite that is not representing those voices. And we just have to look at the ANC to see the problem. at their December conference, we see only one woman elected into the top 6. And let us just also say that although she is a black woman, she's not an African woman. And so the African woman remains the least represented in the political sphere of this country.
Is it that women maybe didn't position themselves as the martyrs, that they necessarily wanted the glory? They were there essentially for the collective, and patriarchy ended up winning, as Kim was saying, in the December elective conference of the ANC. Is it patriarchy, or is it women not positioning themselves adequately?
I think it's very important to just backtrack to history and our history of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. So, for example, we would see that in a rural area, how the men would be forced to go work in the mines, and then the women will be forced to take care of the young, totally removed from the day-to-day developments of the society. And then politics in South Africa become characterized in a very male-dominated space as the male figure, as a representation of those who confront power and not the women in politics. And then we must also take it a step further and to make a clear declaration that there is no way in South Africa where women have not participated in politics. But we've had a dominant narrative, which is white, which is patriarchal, which is very capitalist in nature, to remove women from the whole equation while putting men, and in particular white men, at the forefront of the struggle. So, for example, you think of figures such as Umama Winnie Madikizela Mandela, who was at the forefront in mobilizing society, even at the time when Ubabu Nelson Mandela was detained in prison for such a long time. But how she has been totally reduced into the wife of the icon, and then it ends there. And then we have prominent women such as Umamu Deborah Makhoba, who was at the forefront of the Black consciousness movement during the 70s, leading into the South Africa finally attaining our so-called liberation. This is a woman who was tortured, who stood very firmly by the principles of Black consciousness, that South Africa is first and foremost a Black country, and therefore we are not going to allow a white settler minority role in the country. And if you were to even go into libraries, you will have to search very deeper to find such characters in society, because the narrative and what it means to contribute in developing a nation still remain racist and still remains very patriarchal in its totality.
Now we're talking about decolonization of the system generally, and you've always lamented the fact that we've adopted an apartheid system and tried to amend it here and there, tweak it, and nip and tuck, and not necessarily designed a system that is uniquely for the democratic South Africa. So what are we teaching our children? Are we creating more confusion? Is the leadership and the political ideology so far apart that we essentially scattered? And what's in store then for the future, especially with young women?
Yes, I think Zanele's points are very salient, and we have to see how colonialism disrupted natural patterns of being. And in a pre-colonial Africa and South Africa, the woman was at the forefront. The woman was a very honored part of the family and often a leader in many respects. And that disruption has caused great fragmentation of families. It's fractured families. It's fractured cultural systems and values. And perhaps we can't remedy things properly until we speak about decolonization as a societal change. Because what we're doing is we're crystallizing and accepting the woman's place as a subservient, in a subservient role as almost normal. And that's very dangerous, I mean, to your point. And I think we're missing wonderful opportunities. For instance, last year, I think we were robbed as a country of having one of the most wonderful women leading this country. Dr. Dlamini Zuma is probably the most experienced, most capable, and most competent president we would ever have had. And yet, if we look back to how society accepted her or not, there were questions, particularly in the mainstream media, about her her role as an ex-wife of the former president. There was very little talk about her level of competency, her great stature across Africa, her gravitas in international forums. So what we tend to do is we tend to diminish women in the society. And you said earlier, perhaps women haven't asserted themselves, but I think we're living in a society that does not honor women properly. And I think coming back to Zanele's point, it's a symptom of one of the devastating factors of colonization and how it's disrupted relations between humans and between men and women in this country in the power spectrum.
Look at policy, for example, in getting women in the workplace, the black women, affirmative action had to be introduced to try and get into the economic activities. Black economic empowerment was introduced to now, as if that black women generally are beneficiaries of a system that has been created while we were living vicariously under the sun or under the shade. Kim, do you think that in itself is problematic in not only how we interface as men and women, but interracially as well? And secondly, and how policy also perpetuates that kind of systemic, shall we call it, minimization of women?
Well, I think a system like BEE is very faulty, and it's based on a broader paradigm that isn't working for women. It isn't working for transformation in real terms. And strangely enough, white women have benefited more from BEE than black women, or even black men in some cases. So we need to interrogate those apparent enablers, because what they're doing is just entrenching problems in society, both racially and in terms of gender. And policy is not enough. I think we almost speak about women liberation and women advancement as if it's an afterthought, an afterword to a conversation that we're having about liberation. And I'm inspired by the words, and perhaps we need to take inspiration from the words of a true revolutionary leader, and we don't see many true revolutionary leaders in our own society at the moment. And that is from Thomas Sankara, who spoke always with great honor about women liberation and how we cannot separate our general emancipation from the struggle for women liberation, that any quest for liberation and liberation is embedded with women liberation. And yet often I think it becomes a slogan. So if we look at the ANC framework, for instance, they have a policy framework abundant and rich with women advancement and women liberation, but it's not exercised on the whole. I think, strangely enough, the former president, President Zuma, I think tried to push a lot of young black women into cabinet, and I think that was admirable. But other than that, I don't see many leaders in the organization pushing for women advancement in the true sense. So it's almost a nice to have rather than an imperative in the front line of politics in South Africa at the moment. And that must change. What's encouraging, and where I take what I see as encouraging, is that in perhaps the more revolutionary movements in this country, like Fees Must Fall, I think they've done a superb job of placing women in the forefront. And if we look at the leadership, it's been quite visibly female. And I think the current political structures, political parties, could take a lesson from the Fees Must Fall movement in that regard.
All right, we'll continue our discussion, and of course with our esteemed panelists looking at women in politics here on Women in Focus. What more do we need to do to create an egalitarian and equal society that will honor and respect young women and ensure that they thrive in society? We also took to the streets to speak to some of our viewers on what they think around policy and the effect that women has had in our experience. So take a look at this.
Yes, and kondu ukuthi balingene ba enough omama bakhoyo kwipolitics, but ndicinga mna ukuthi ukuze omama sibe enough kwipolitics ndicinga ukuthi kufuneka omama bafune. Yabona singomama sinoloyiko, singomama sinaso isibindi. Maybe if kungaba khona omama banesibindi sokuvelela ukuthi sifuna ukuthi omama ukuthi bethenge nyawo phansi ukuthi sifuna ukuthi singomama nathi sibe khona kwipolitics, mhlawumbe omama bangangena.
Bomme ba bangata ba irata politiki, and then ba rata le hore ba ka ba di leaders tsa di politiki, and then le nna I'm willing to gore ka ngwa go mongwe go bane le president ya mme. ke a duma gore or vice president ya bomme e ska no ba bontate fela. And they're still there, but they bomme le bana ba rona re busy ra ba lena gore ba kgone go tsenella kudu mo dipolotiking gore future e tle be ya bona.
Young women tlamele ithute gore e kene ka ra women's league, then bomme ba ra ka ra women's league ba rute young women or ho etsahalang ka ra women's league.
O sa nyaka basadi ba bantsi in politics, but some re sa kola sa na le that perception ya gore mosadi mmereko wa hae ke ko kitchen, and ke kgatelelo. We must try to bring the women out of the kitchen so that they can participate. So ba kgone ba le di-business le bona, ba kgone bona gore ho etsahalang around the country, because the country without a woman is not a country.
So our viewers saying that sometimes women do not step up to the plate. We are our worst enemy when it comes to participating in the politics and also changing or reform in that particular space. I guess Zanele Luana and Kim Heller, just your reaction to that. And we know that with former AU Commissioner Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma saying that in changing that cabinet, it was very difficult because women especially in the African culture, had never really been given this space or platform to be in politics, that many would shy away from that. So how do we overcome that particular barrier?
Okay. For myself as a revolutionary and the type of movement that I belong to, which is Black First, Land First, we looked at our lived experience as a direct consequence of colonialism. So for example, one of the rubber stamps of colonialism and slavery, not only in South Africa, within the African continent and in the diaspora as well, was a sign of conquering using the black women, right? So the rape from the slave master and all those kinds of things to demonize the character and literally reduce women into nothing. But I think we must also recognize that we live in a very changing society, but there are still elements of resistance, particularly from male figures who have built all their lives as political leaders, and most of them still can't imagine themselves having women issuing orders and all those kinds of things. And we must be practical about it. So I'll give you an example. For example, in a movement that I belong to, you would know that we've had a long struggle with the former public protector, Advocate Thuli Madonsela, and one day we were there occupying the office, and Mr. Kevin Malunga was passing by, and someone said, "We don't even respect you. What kind of a man are you being led by women?" You know, referring to Thuli Madonsela. And most of us, myself as the deputy president, Comrade Thandiso Ayapi as the treasurer general, we had to deal with that situation right there to say, well, right now you belong into a black consciousness, Pan-Africanist movement. And if you didn't know, comrade, we do not entertain such comments, and we are not going to entertain them. But at the same time, to have a political education program where comrades are going to understand the role that women should continue to play in society. But if we do not deal with colonialism and dispossession of the black majority, we are going to continue dealing with rape. Others are dealing with social grants.
I think the question is the gender activism or activists amongst all of us, and primarily in political parties. We'll see whether ANC, let's say in Parliament, would have a 50-50 gender parity. That's not reflective in their top six currently. I'm not sure about the other parties in their numbers of representation, but generally it doesn't seem like there is a gender activism, particularly for women outside of the social media realm.
Absolutely, and I think it's because we do not put it top of agenda. So, I mean, if I had, you know, I mean, the ANC seemed to have readily accepted the top six as if it's a normal trend that emerged. And there should have been a proper interrogation of that. I'd also spoken, I think, on a previous show with you about that I was hoping the ANC would overcorrect that issue of gender within their other structures. But we haven't seen that. So the NEC and top structures are still not representative of women, particularly young women. And this seems to be replicated. So as I was saying earlier, we're crystallizing this and seeing this as normal. We're not disrupting the system. And to fix a little bit here or there, I think, as Zanele says, we're going to be dealing with ad hoc issues on a sporadic and non-systematic way. And until we address these things systematically, nothing's going to change. But there seems to be no level of consciousness amongst most of our political parties around the issue of gender. Women come second, and that is something that seems to be acceptable. Except that I do say, that I've said earlier, that we are seeing an emerging trend amongst younger organizations like Fees Must Fall, where they're pushing women into the front row. And I think a young organization like BLF, if you look at their officials and representation, it's very female-rich. And I think these are things that people must look at coming into the election. Am I, as a woman, being represented? Is this organization I'm voting for fair and representative of my interests as a woman? And these are questions that we must put top of mind as we vote.
Let's talk about the Constitution and its role in ensuring that there's equal rights, there's equal opportunity, access to basic amenities, education for women, albeit that there is still this income gap between rich and poor. Zanele, going forward, that this is at least suppose a beacon of hope or something we can hold on to in forging the way forward.
Again, I think it's very important to look at the Constitution from the perspective of the movement that I belong to, because the Constitution in itself was not drafted by the majority of this country. They adopted it through the African National Congress, which was the biggest liberation movement at that time. And it's public knowledge that it's two white men that wrote the Constitution. I think Ralph Meyer is one of them, with Cyril Ramaphosa, right? The Constitution is a document based on historical theft, which gives property rights to the white settler minority, land that was taken from the black majority. So any progressive policy positions that might be pushed by the Constitution in terms of access to education for all, access to basic services, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, cultural alignment, and all those kinds of things, they really become null and void, because the greatest crime that has divided us so much as the black majority in this country has not been dealt with. That's why in the Constitution, you ensure education for all, but you look at the people who are the most uneducated, it's the black majority in this country. You speak of freedom of speech. White media in this country can write lies about black people and all kinds of things, write lies about the former president of the country, write lies about prominent black leaders, and get away with it. Because the Constitution, they know it favors them, and therefore should only be used in reference to further entrench our own oppression as the black majority. So what the Constitution says does not matter at this point, because 24 years into democracy, the Constitution has not come into our defense, and in particular as black women in this country.
Yeah, you were saying that true freedom will never materialize unless women are emancipated, and women in ourselves facing many other challenges, gender violence or discrimination, and just hardship really, even in the workplace where you have to work 10 times as hard, you know, to prove yourself. So if the Constitution is not something that we can use as a springboard, what then is there that we can hold on to and compel government or policymakers to adhere to certain things that women require?
Well, maybe there needs to be a revision of a true feminism. But if you look at the feminism that seems to have taken root in South Africa, it's quite white and westernized. And I think that goes back to the point that we're adhering to a foreign westernized system. And that includes something like the Constitution, which possibly within itself requires remedy and reversioning, because it is a document that perhaps and a framework that perhaps is keeping black people in slavery as opposed to being a liberating mechanism. So I think perhaps it's time. We've been in this so-called free South Africa for 24 years. Perhaps it's time to look at our legal system, to look at the mechanisms that we are seeing as liberating, and seeing if they're not perhaps imprisoning black people even further. And the Constitution, to me, is quite a liberal document. I'm not sure if that's going to be the doctrine of woman liberation or black liberation in this country. So let's interrogate. If they need to be reversioned, if they need to be revolutionized, let's do that. If they need to be thrown aside in the development of something that is true to this country and more reflective of women's rights at a material level, let's do that.
All right, just closing remarks before we go, in the sense that going forward, especially as you're saying, people are frustrated. We've had 24 years or so of a trial run of this Rainbow Nation, the Constitution in itself lauded around the world, but not materially meaning much to the majority who are still marginalized. So what needs to happen in your views, Zanen?
I think practical examples would be the most important with this particular matter. So, for example, we have discussed it within my movement. So, for example, there's the idea of the nuclear family, for example, which is very racist and capitalist in it. It has strong correlations with the emergence of slavery and us as African countries being colonized, for example. So, for example, as a woman, if I have a child, for example, I have to spend quite a majority of time nurturing that child and making sure that child is safe. And there's a phenomena within our own Africanness where, so we usually say the village raises the child. So we are also thinking around establishing community centers. So, for example, so when a child comes from school, they go to a center where they would get a proper meal, where they would get someone who's passionate about that to help them with homework and many other basic things. This will act as a relief, we believe, for most women leaders, really, who want to contribute into dismantling the roots of colonialism and fully contribute into shaping the country into a different one, into a respecting country, into a country that puts black people first. And also to deal with matters in our own workspaces. Again, it also speaks to ownership, because now how do we force through reform in companies that still remain so white in South Africa and that still remain in the hands of the Oppenheimers and the Rupert family? We need to interrogate, how is it that in 2018, just on the basis that I am a female, I earn lesser than my female counterpart? But we must deal with the feminism question, which I think movements such as Rose Must Fall and Fees Must Fall have failed dismally, because the women leaders have built their profile on saying black men are trash while dislocating the thing as a colonial
all the other
problem.
segments as we continue with the program. But I just want to conclude with you, Kim, in how women then can interrogate or step up to the plate when it comes to issues of gender equality, and not being the only one in the boardroom where you are essentially suppressed and you don't have a view.
Well, I think, I don't know that it's incumbent upon women to fight for themselves. There needs to be a society that accommodates that. And like, why is the burden of woman liberation on women? We have to have a society, if we're speaking about a free and liberated society, we need to make sure that every instrument of society speaks to that. So perhaps to conclude, and I'm probably paraphrasing him very badly, Thomas Sankara, liberating women is not an act of charity. It's an imperative to any revolution or liberation cause. And unless we embrace that systemically and attitudinally, we are not going to advance women in this country.
I must appreciate our inaugural guests here for Women in Focus for joining us, Kim Heller, who is a political analyst and contributing writer to The New Age. And we have Zanele Luana, who is Deputy President of Black First, the Land First, joining us. You at home, you're most welcome to join us on social media. It's at ANN7 TV or at I am Cindy Mabi. And thanks again for watching. Until we meet again. Cheers for now.